Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place where we share creative and inspiring learning in our schools. Episode 70. Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast with me, Mark Taylor. Today I'm joined by Noah Tetzner, and he is the creator and host of the History of Vikings podcast. And I met Noah through a online community in the podcast world, and the thing I've always loved about the podcast world is it's just so enthusiastic, it's so supportive of everyone, and he was really keen to come on and share his insights really into education, and I like the fact that we've got this sort of history element going on, and I'm keen to explore how people listening to podcasts and how that's going to change the way people are learning, certainly within school as well as out of school. So Noah, thanks very much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's really a pleasure to be here. Fantastic.
So can you give us a little bit of history about, obviously people are here from the accent that you're from America, so a bit of a background about where you live and how you got involved in the podcasting world and especially your interest in the Vikings.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I live in Wisconsin in the United States, so Midwestern United States. And I've always loved history. It's been just a lifelong passion of mine. Ever since I was, just a really little kid, I've always just been so enamored with history and really the great stories and characters that are in history. And I suppose my passion for Vikings is kind of more of a new passion in that I recently discovered it upon hearing the stories of the Norse myths, so Norse mythology. Right, these characters are so popular in the Marvel movies and comics, but they were actually real characters in history as well, in a way. I discovered the primary sources, that the Vikings had for Norse mythology, and after discovering these epic myths and stories of the Norse gods, I became even more fascinated with the people behind the myths, the Vikings, and just their rich history and just the incredible feats that they faced in their accomplishments. It's been so fascinating. But I've always listened to podcasts, and I decided that I wanted to start one myself. And I thought Vikings would be a good topic. It's kind of a very niche market. So I went into it and started the History of Vikings podcast. And I suppose the rest is history. I've just had the absolute joy of being able to connect with so many fellow history lovers and people who are excited about podcasting, and it's just been a real joy of mine.
And we were just mentioning off air before that one of the key things that makes your podcast different, certainly to some others, especially in that kind of history space, is the fact that you've been interviewing some really interesting people about it, and it's not just your version of your learned reading and that kind of thing, but it's actually some really in-depth interviews with some really great academics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've had many exciting people on my podcast before. I've had Professor Caroline Larrington, professor of medieval literature at Oxford University, and Tom Shippey, who is sort of one of the world's leading Tolkien scholars, and Anders Winroth, a notable Viking scholar of Yale University, and all these exciting people. And it's so interesting to hear to kind of compare the conversations I've had with them, because oftentimes the topics that we talk about tend to overlap from interview to interview. So it's really interesting to hear different takes on the same topic. That's been one thing that's just been absolutely fascinating when just doing this podcast.
And who are the sorts of people that are listening? Are they students trying to learn history? Are they adults who are interested in that kind of subject, or is it a mixture? Do you have any sort of insights into who's actually really sort of engaged with it in such a big way?
I think it's probably more of an adult leaning audience at this point, just because of the style that I'm going for with my show. In-depth scholarly academic discussions, but I always present something in a way that could be enjoyed by a younger student or somebody who has no idea about history or Vikings. But I would like to think that my show can be and is enjoyed by people of all different ages. And I just love it when I get emails. I got an email the other day from a young person who actually happened to be homeschooled as I was, 17 as well, and he was just talking about how he enjoyed my podcast, and that really was just heartwarming to see because I really try to present something in a way that can be enjoyed by a young person and a person of great age alike.
And let's just delve in a little bit about the podcasting world and in terms of people learning things generally, obviously not just history. I mean, I have to say that an awful lot of the things that I've learned in recent years have been certainly through podcasting, and that's certainly been my sort of entry into learning about different things. So you said just there that you're 17 and you were really into podcasts as well. So how did you get into sort of listening to podcasts and it becoming part of your world? And how do you think it's actually, or people your age are being supported by all this material that's out there on a sort of on-demand kind of audio way now?
Well, I got into podcasting because my dad was very into podcasting. He just listened to a lot of business podcasts, a lot of podcasts about starting podcasts, the Solopreneur Hour with Michael O'Neill and Pat Flynn and John Lee Dumas and Cliff Ravenscraft. And listening to those guys, it was really inspiring and, sort of like, wow, I could do this. I could start a podcast and that would be fun. And I always remember thinking, if I could just get 1,000 people to listen to my podcast, wow, that would be such an accomplishment. And, sure enough, I did. And it was just super exciting that I, had this group of people that was really excited about Vikings that I could nerd out with, these history nerds. But I think, just like you said, I learned so much from listening to podcasts. I listen to podcasts when I ride my bike. I listen to podcasts while I play my computer games. I listen to podcasts all the time. And I just learn so much. And, certainly there's YouTube videos and lectures and other ways that somebody can go about learning history or anything. But what I love about podcasts is they're just really condensed information in, reasonable 30-minute to an hour snippets, which I think is so powerful. And, it's just kind of that intimacy that you get when listening to a podcast, when you're plugging your headphones in and you can hear these people right in your ears telling you information and sharing experiences with you and telling stories. That's what I love about podcasting.
I think that's absolutely right. And it is that kind of, it's that kind of personal contact. It's almost like they're having an individual conversation with you, isn't it? In lots of ways, which I find very, very heartwarming, really, and very supportive, because you really feel like they've got your back, or they're on your side, or they're like your personal tutor. And the flip side, in terms of people listening when you're actually the host and you've created something, is exactly like you said. If you get 1,000 people listening, if you imagine being on stage in a room and 1,000 people actually listening to what you're doing, that's a large audience. Let alone, when you start getting into the multiples of thousands and beyond, and it's just that being able to sort of connect with people. And that's why you said, when you get the feedback from people as well, that really just makes it all come to life. And I think as the podcast world grows and more people start to do it, and they start to want to get more and more information in whichever subject they're doing, because of course there's such a diverse amount of podcasts out there now that you can actually find whatever it is that you're interested in. And like you say, you've got it on the move, whatever you're doing, wherever you are, there's something and a place for you to do it. And I think that's the really exciting thing about how podcasts are, especially for young people as well, who are obviously very audio based, are going to make a big difference.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. And that's sort of something that I struggled with in the early days of my podcast, but just in recent weeks and in just this past month, that's something that I've really been working on. Is, like you said, just take 1,000 people, or even 100 or 200 people. If you can imagine yourself on a stage in front of just 100 people, man, that's huge. I mean, if I brought 100 people over to my house right now, I mean, the place would be packed. So I think, for podcasters, sometimes it can be difficult to imagine that people are actually listening to you. They're listening to you fairly consistently and regularly. But I always try, when I record my podcast episodes, to imagine myself in a sort of theater or auditorium, just having a conversation with whatever guest I'm having. And people are, sitting around in chairs as sort of a fireside chat, because it just really brings it to life, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And And in terms of sort of your education experience and how you learn yourself, you said about doing it while you're gaming or out on your bike or that kind of thing. But how about sort of slightly more in-depth education learning as well? Because I know you've had quite a diverse background in terms of being in school and homeschooling as well. So give us a little bit of background about how that sort of shaped your learning and also your desire for what you want to be doing sort of from here on in.
Yeah, so I've always loved history. It's just always been just such a lifelong passion of mine. I guess I'm kind of not really a regular teenage guy in that sense. I've never been into sports. I've never played football or soccer or anything like that. I've always been kind of the person who preferred to get away from it all and just focus on history, whether it was watching, countless BBC documentaries or reading history books or talking with my grandparents or other people about history. I've always just loved that. And, being homeschooled growing up from first grade to eighth grade, I really had a lot of time to focus on history. And, of course I was learning other things as well, but history was always something that I spent a lot of time on. So it was really great in that regard. But then when I went to private school, so from ninth grade to 11th grade, my passion for history really came to life there, especially in the first year of me being there, because I really lucked out in that my history teacher was an amazing guy, just absolutely passionate about history. I remember he would play documentaries during his classes that I had just watched about every single one. He actually was a bit of a historical gamer himself. He happened to play a lot of the same games that I did, and I remember before and after lunch and, before and after class, I would always just talk about history with him, just have these like basically hour-long discussions, just kind of geeking out about history. And he really saw a passion for history in me. And perhaps it was because I was one of the only people in my small class that loved history, but it was really special that he was able to do that. And that really, I would say that he really inspired me and continued to inspire my love for history in a way.
And I guess that's the thing about good teachers, isn't it? It's their passion coming through to the student, which is a really important thing. But when they can see your passion as well in that kind of engagement, then I guess that's when you get a dynamic which is quite hard to quantify, but it's that thing that where we all think, oh yeah, I remember that teacher because, and I guess that's the sport you're talking about there.
Yeah, no, definitely. He really brought history to life, and this goes for any teacher, whether they're a teacher of history or science or music or language or anything. I think it's really just about bringing those subjects to life, because they're really more than just subjects. They're actually real life scenarios and real life pieces of information. They just happen to be taught in more of a school setting. So I remember he would take all of the chairs in the classroom and arrange them in a giant circle, and we would have sort of like historical debates in a way. Nothing heated, but we would take historical issues like the Vietnam War or free trade and protectionism, and not in a political sense, but just analyzing these different historical topics. And we would kind of debate, did this happen in a way that was beneficial to that country and the people living there, or should this country have perhaps tried something different? So I thought that really brought it to life for a lot of students.
And did you get the chance to sort of do sort of any sort of field trips, any sort of visits outside of the school as well?
Come to think of it, in terms of history, we really didn't go on any field trips, which is kind of a shame. Perhaps they went on a few field trips now, but I remember I took ancient Greece, and this isn't really a field trip, but again, this just kind of goes along with my history teacher's passion. So he also taught ancient Greek. It was a classical school, and I remember when we just had this big final exam, we all went to this Greek restaurant in town here that made like traditional Greek gyros and baklava and everything. It was really a great time. So he just had this contagious passion.
And I guess it's really often education, you really connect, isn't it? When you feel something about it, or when you can sort of feel like you're actually engaging in the whole thing in a way. And I guess, I mean, field trips are great and leaving school is great, and I've had some recent conversations with people about how that can really support children. But like you said, just moving the tables and chairs out of the way and just changing the format of, rather than the students listening to the teacher lecture them essentially on what they're doing, and actually engaging in a separate way, that really is the key, isn't it?
I think you're absolutely right, Mark. And I think, unfortunately, and a lot of people listening who are teachers, I'm sure, experience this all the time. But I think one thing that's really unfortunate with our young people in this generation is so many are just unmotivated, just about learning, but I think about life more generally. A lot of them come from, difficult situations at home, but a lot of them just don't really get excited about much at all, which is really a shame. And I think that's kind of our job, or should be our mission, is to get them excited. And, by being excited ourselves, we can really sort of ignite that flame for passionate learning, which is just so important, I remember, like I said, my history teacher, and actually I had a pretty good science teacher thinking back as well. Always happy to answer questions, always happy to go on digressions and talk about things that were not really in the textbook that day, but were indeed related to the topic. And it was just really, really exciting. And I think that's really important, is to get people motivated about learning.
I think that two-way street, like you said, is really important. And I think these days, I mean, certainly here in the UK, teachers have to plan to the nth degree often. And so deviating from what they may have already planned can be tricky for some teachers. But I think actually when you've take away some of that planning and actually then just have a much broader idea of where you're going, but then be able to ebb and flow with the questions and actually engage with people who've got things they want to find out more, that's when I think that excitement and that learning starts to really come through, and I think it's important, and it also feels like it's a two-way street then, and everyone's learning from each other, and I think that's a really positive way of actually being in school, because you feel like it's a learning experience rather than just something you have to do, and I think that really can help everybody in the class. I
couldn't agree more, and that's one thing, and it's understandable as well, and I'm not a teacher, but perhaps I will be one of sorts one day, is it isn't, a lot of people feel the need to get through the textbook and do everything on time, which is important, but I guess you kind of have to evaluate the situation and say, what is the end goal here? And I think that the end goal should be to inspire passionate learners, because learning should be something that never stops and something that's lifelong. So I really well said.
As someone who's much closer to their schooling than I am, I'm being really interested to hear your thoughts on, you said that passion and that engagement you got from your science teacher and specifically your history teacher, but you said you weren't particularly into sports in the same kind of way. So how did you get through school in terms of those subjects which you were less interested in? Did you still feel like you were just having to make do, or did you just think, well, I'm just going to focus on the stuff I really like and just put up with the rest of it? What was your mindset, and how did you just still keep motivated for the things which were important to you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and certainly, just like anyone else, there was some subjects that I wasn't too keen on. Like I remember taking logic class, and that was just one that I really didn't resonate with. I wasn't a huge fan of the class. I've never really been a science guy, but I will say that my last science teacher was really an inspiration as well. But I think I definitely spent a lot of time focusing on those subjects that I did love. But perhaps I had a more positive attitude in that I was like, okay, if I have to take this class, I can either be very negative about it and dread the class, but that's not really going to change the circumstance, in that I'm going to, I have to learn these subjects anyway. So I really would have a positive attitude about it. And I think that's one thing that's really awesome about education I love it when subjects interlap and cross over each other. Like, this thing in history was happening at the same time that this scientific discovery was made, and these great speakers and orators and logic existed at the same time. And we can really see everything kind of weave together. And I think that's what made a lot of those subjects that weren't particularly exciting more tolerable and enjoyable.
I think that's often a really important thing, isn't it? Is attitude is really key, and sort of almost going full circle really with the podcast. And that idea is the fact that if something is lighting your fire, you can now, as we said before, find information about it elsewhere, and also just wrap it all together. Like you say, having that idea of what's going on in a certain amount of time and how that fits in together, and that whole idea of being able to, I guess, just make it an event rather than a subject. And it's certainly something I've enjoyed from my musical background. I'm teaching music, but at the same time you've got a bit of history about how you got to this type of music and who the people were that influenced it. And if we record something, you've got all the technology element as well, and there's a whole sort of maths thing that you can do when you're talking about pulse and various rhythm games and that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden the whole class becomes a multifaceted lesson, which people don't necessarily think of. They just think it's just this particular thing. But I think if you can sort of bring all that out as a teacher, and then you can really speak to the people, like say, even if it's not a subject they perceive to be something they're interested in, you might actually, as you get to know the students, be able to really sort of identify what you can support them with to actually make it a bit more tolerable, or certainly a bit more interesting for them.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. That's really well said. And it's difficult to do that with particular students, especially when you have larger classes, of 20, 30, 40, 50 people, etc. But I think that's what it's all about, is just bringing everything full circle and bringing everything together. And that's really exciting that you can see that as, somebody who's really involved with the music. I think that's awesome.
So give us some podcasts and some, we talked before we came online, I think, about YouTube and the sort of the community that you're involved in. What are some other things that people can take away if they're interested in history and learning in that type of sort of podcast and visual and audio way?
I think that it's whatever you're interested in, literally whatever you're interested in. Since we live in such an incredible digital age, there's just everything you could basically want to know about anything out there for the most part. Whether it be podcasting or YouTube or anything like that. I think it's just incredible that we live in such a digital time when it's all out there. Like, I know for me personally, again, I talked about how I loved Norse mythology, but I've always loved sort of mythologies in general. That's been a real big interest of mine. And I've recently discovered the mythology of the country of Finland, known as the Kalevala. And unfortunately, since all of the sources and footnotes that we have for that, other than the actual copy of the poem, are in Finnish, it's been really difficult to sort of understand, especially because it's written in such a lofty, heady way. But thanks to the internet, I've just really dug deep and been able to find things that really were able to be great companions to that. So I think that whatever you're passionate about, just go for it. I know learning is such a satisfying thing, and it happens inside the classroom and outside of the classroom alike.
And do you think some of these sort of expansions of the things that you're interested in, do you think that'll affect your podcast? Can you see your podcast heading in slightly different directions, or do you think Vikings are where it will stay at for now?
No, I'd like to think that I could expand. I was just about to, actually, in the online community that we're in, I was just about to kind of bring up a topic about rebranding, because while I absolutely love the Vikings and will certainly continue to talk about that, there's just so many contemporaries of the Vikings in history that I wish I could have more liability to talk about on my podcast. And at the end of the day, I'm sure a lot of people would enjoy it. But who knows? I might start another podcast in a few months. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. Perhaps a medieval literature podcast, just kind of exploring the Canterbury Tales and the Song of Roland and all these medieval texts. But yeah, that's kind of my experience and where I see it going.
Fantastic. So Just to finish off, can you give some people some information about where they can find you, and so that if they want to hear more, they can go and check you out, and I just think being able to share all that with everybody, whether they're history buffs or whether they just want to hear someone who's passionate about what they're doing, will be of great value to everyone.
Yeah, so you can find my podcast, The History of Vikings, just wherever you listen to your podcasts, iTunes, wherever. You can also check out my new YouTube channel, The History of Vikings, or follow me on Twitter at History of Viking.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for sharing your education thoughts and your background and also your podcast, and I wish you every success in the future. And it's so refreshing to hear someone who's just passionate about what they're doing and have actually gone out and made a difference in their life and created something, and that comes across when you listen to the podcast. And I wish you every success in the future.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for the amazing opportunity to come on the show today.
Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.